So our next speaker is Sofia Alli. Sofia joined us from Washington, D.C. She has a background in environmental analysis and policy and is interested in the intersection between policy and marine conservation, especially in Latin America, where she's really focused her studies both before getting here and while she's been here. Sofia went to COP, which is the climate negotiation, the UN climate negotiations in Dubai this fall. We always have an opportunity to send one student, and Sofia was just sort of head and shoulders above everyone else in making the case for why she should go. And I know she took a lot away from that experience, and we were really proud to have her representing Scripps. And you might even get to hear a little bit about it in her presentation today. The name of her presentation is Beneath the Surface, Uncovering Climate Change in Tabasco. Welcome, Sofia.
Thank you. El Bosque is a quiet town on the edge of Tabasco, Mexico's wetlands, mangrove wetlands. In the 1980s, a small group of people moved to this little peninsula and would go out to fish in groups of 4. They would bring back buckets of tarpon and long-streaked snook. From these humble beginnings, El Bosque built a small community equipped with churches, schools, and residential areas. As the years went on, fishing remained a major source of income and a large part of the culture. For Guadalupe Cobos, pictured here, a resident of El Bosque, her routine was to go out and fish. She would always come home and sell what she had caught, and the next day, she would do it all over again. Guadalupe loved El Bosque, and she loved the sea. She described her life in El Bosque as living in harmony with the sea, and she would say that most of the community depended on the sea for their livelihood. She described El Bosque as very vibrant. Guadalupe says, like any other community, they would celebrate every holiday and they would always come together. However, as of last Christmas, El Bosque has officially ceased to exist. The disappearance of this town was not an isolated incident. In fact, this town had been gradually disappearing over the last 2 decades, with 2019 being a year that a huge storm came and caused tremendous flooding, which swept away the first row of homes. However, the reason for the gradual disappearance of this town can be attributed to sea level rise, which is a consequence of climate change. In 2005, the town was fully intact. The image depicts the drastic change in land mass over the last 20 years, with 2023 marking a pivotal year in the disappearance of this town. It took less than 20 years for this town to fully vanish. 2 years ago, this town housed over 700 people, and last year, before December, only 12 remained, Guadalupe being one of them. Guadalupe says the once vibrant El Bosque is uninhabitable now, and she says the hardest part about all of this has been losing the community they once had. Before the declaration of this town being completely gone, the local school was destroyed in 2022. The community wells were full of salt water, and electricity was infrequent. The town had clearly been suffering for years before it was officially gone. And Guadalupe, among many other former El Bosque community members, all blame climate change for their lost home. This should not have happened. In fact, it wasn't supposed to happen. But this did happen, and it happened even though this region had a climate change adaptation plan in place. So, what is a climate change adaptation plan, and how could it have helped El Bosque? A climate change adaptation plan is a plan developed by a governing body, such as the UN, the World Bank, or even a national government. A climate change adaptation plan is a multi-step process that contains a variation of assessment, planning, implementation, and an element of monitoring and evaluation. It integrates climate change adaptation planning into the government, into multi-level programming, including operations and management. Many different iterations of climate adaptation plans exist, popular ones being the UNFCCC Climate Adaptation Framework and NOAA's Steps to Resilience. The one pictured here is from the National Park Service. My capstone project centers on the wetlands and coastal communities in Tabasco, Mexico, that are at risk of the devastating impacts of climate change. Tabasco was one of 3 states in Mexico selected for the adaptation to climate change impacts on coastal wetlands in the Gulf of Mexico project. But this name is very long, so I'll be calling it CAP for short. This climate adaptation plan was the first attempt by the World Bank and the Global Environment Facility to support climate change adaptation measures in Mexico. This project began in 2010 and ended in 2017. One goal of my capstone project was to understand why towns like El Bosque vanished, despite having measures in place to protect them. This consisted of taking apart this cap and analyzing how its goals have been implemented and whether its proposed measures and actions have actually been sustained in this region. I compared the framework of this cap to a climate adaptation plan framework published by the UN to see gaps and opportunities for improvements, and as a result, I have compiled a report with comprehensive case studies, including the story of El Bosque and an illegally built oil refinery that cleared a mangrove ecosystem. Lastly, my report is complete with 4 policy recommendations to improve climate adaptation plans in the future. All this in mind, I have concluded that this cap was not well conceived to reduce vulnerability to climate change, and my reason for this conclusion are as follows. First of all, there were limited response plans and monitoring in the cap that actually addressed pressing concerns in this region, such as flood response. These limited climate change response plans also did not contain any long-term data collection system. Tabasco is a region marked with high recorded levels of rainfall and frequent flooding. The success indicators in this cap were more related to whether the funds allocated to this project were actually spent, not how they were spent or what they were spent on. And the topic of funding comes up a lot in this cap, as the World Bank blames the lack of funding for countries like Mexico not having the capacity to face climate change. Sea level rise is a pressing issue in Mexico. A quarter of Tabasco is said to be inundated by 2050, and places like the Emerald Coast and Veracruz, another Mexican state, are also said to be falling into the sea. This is a map of predicted sea level rise in Mexico. As you can see, many coastal communities are at risk of suffering the same fate as El Bosque. The only way to prevent this is to have a more substantial and robust climate adaptation plan in place that actually consider a region holistically and comprehensively. This can start with more research and attention being given to these regions. This also looks like collaborations between governments, educational institutions, state-owned enterprises, and any other entity with power over a region. The indicators in this cap also don't outline any plan to keep up any long-term data collection. Having comprehensive monitoring and evaluation systems in place would have been very beneficial to tracking climate change adaptation across the whole of Mexico. This data would have also been useful in making more informed climate policy, and it also would have been useful for the World Bank to keep within their own database. This is not to say that these institutions for data collection don't exist within Mexico. In fact, there are many long-term climate data collection institutions within Mexico. However, they were just not included or incorporated into this cap at all. Second, there was a restructuring of this cap halfway into its 7-year implementation period, which really would not have been necessary if this region had been properly researched by the World Bank before this cap was implemented. The restructuring assessed some of the goals put in place by the cap and resulted in many newly restructured objectives that took away from the value of the cap due to the newly lowered expectations. Key factors such as figuring out whether or not Tabasco had protected wetlands were overlooked, and due to this, there was a need for the creation of a land use plan, which was not in place before. This is indicative of a much larger issue within this cap, which is the lack of research that went into Tabasco as a region. And the cap did not understand what the communities here really needed. There was no assessment of any existing institutions or infrastructure in Tabasco that the World Bank could have worked with, and there was no community collaboration in the planning process of this cap, which is essential for its success. Lastly, this cap did not address pressing regional issues such as displacement due to climate change. The most relevant policy recommendation that I created in response to this point is the need for a national plan that focuses on displacement due to climate change. It should be integrated into the government climate policy and climate adaptation frameworks. Although the climate adaptation frameworks in general and newly created loss and damage funds are a strong start, they are simply not enough. Loss and damage exist separately from climate adaptation plans, and this separation is critical when understanding why communities become homeless and displaced with no plan to rehabilitate them. A national plan for this is recommended because it would be integrated into any future climate change strategies proposed in Mexico's government, and it would provide opportunities and resources to those who have been victims of climate change and those who will be victims of climate change. This is important because climate adaptation plans are the future of climate change response. The UNFCCC framework I used to analyze this was created at the 2022 UN Climate Change Conference of Parties. I was fortunate enough to attend this last year's Climate Change Conference of Parties, and I got to witness how new funds such as the UN Loss and Damages Fund were planning for their implementation this year. As helpful and useful as these new funds are, they have only just begun to take effect this year and offer no solution for those who are currently homeless and displaced and have no institutions to help them acquire these funds, such as the residents in El Bosque. The World Bank created this cap without an understanding of Tabasco and its needs, which is something that cannot happen again. There is no one-size-fits-all approach to climate change adaptation plans, which is something many institutions default to because it's easier to apply these generalizations to a region. And this extends further than just to Mexico. Despite contributing some of the least amount of emissions, regions like Africa and South America bear the burden of climate change. They are seen as responsible for climate change because they are regions with exploitation and high variability when it comes to climate policy and environmental concerns. Ultimately, it is imperative that the future of climate change adaptation shifts drastically. Every nation is incredibly unique and worth protecting, and the world is full of examples like El Bosque. Thank you. I wanted to thank my capstone advisory committee for assisting me with this project. It could not have been done without you guys. And I want to thank my friends and family for their unwavering support over the last year. Thank you.
All right, I have a question. Can you talk a little bit about how the role of state-owned enterprises in Mexico play into climate change adaptation?
Yeah, so this was another element of the collaboration that was lacking. So essentially, state-owned enterprises such as Pemex, for example, they play a massive role in climate policy and just in Mexico's government in general. And so without having these organizations in the conversation, it's very difficult to get anything done in terms of climate policy in Mexico.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was fascinating. You were talking about the limited connections between what the community really needed and what was reflected in the cap.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could talk about that same dynamic at the more global level, like when you were at COP, what was your observation about the ways that community participation and grassroots participation in COP has or hasn't influenced what actually goes on there?
One thing I noticed is that a lot of, I guess, like NGOs and stuff, they didn't really have a super prominent seat at the table when it came to making these making these policy in terms of like the loss and damage fund. It was these people who would represent the nations who were kind of making these choices and stuff, and not really including community members and people who actually are on the ground where this is happening. You could see a little bit in terms of like the NGOs that were present there, but in terms of the people who are actually having a seat at the table and making these choices and decisions, they just weren't very present.
Sofia, you talk about we need to think also in climatic refugees. What are your thoughts about it, or what recommendations do you have about that kind of considerations?
Yeah, so you have these funds like the Loss and Damage Fund, which is supposed to cover communities that are at risk of having climate refugees. However, there is no plan in place that actually addresses them. And I mean, so there are funds that exist that actually can help out these people, but the thing is that you need to apply for them through the government and through these institutions, and their homes are gone and their governments are gone. They have no one there who's doing that for them. So a plan for this needs to be integrated into climate adaptation plans, because you can't necessarily combat climate change and its impacts if you're not helping those people who are already at risk and already suffering from the impacts.
We've got one back there. Okay.
Hi, as an individual living in the United States, is there anything that we can do beyond voting, or is that our only way of kind of helping with this?
I think a good place to start is to just raise awareness. I think because like for El Bosque, I had to really dig and find out a lot about this town. There wasn't much information that was readily available to more like Western media. So I think it's more about just trying to be a little bit more aware of what's going on around us in the world in that sense. So I think awareness is the first step.
All right. Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Sofia.